This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Salmond. So welcome to Scotland Speaks with Salmond, and an introduction to not just one programme but 4 programmes over the month of September. These are programmes which are about what if, because let's go back to September the 19th, 2014, the day after the independence referendum. But instead of narrowly voting no, Scotland voted yes. And 10 years later, I'm still First Minister, preparing for retirement, but the questions what we're going to ask in these 4 programmes are what would Scotland look like now, 10 years after independence? Would we be better off, worse off? What would our relationship with Europe be, the rest of the UK? What's the social life of Scotland going to look like? And how about Scotland in an international context? Over this series of 4 programmes, I'll be interviewing 4 key experts on the economy and the social life of Scotland, on Scotland International and in Scotland's politics. We'll be seeing what an independent Scotland would look like in the year 2024, 10 years after voting for independence. Life full of what might have been. We know what the last 10 years have been like. I reckon it would have been a lot better over the last 10 years. But let's see what our experts got to say. And today's programme will lead off with Dr. Jim Walker, one of the world's foremost economists, a Scot, spends most of his time working in Asia. Who better to look at what Scotland might have done economically over the last decade if the vote had been yes for independence? Well, Dr. Jim Walker, we've got the job of reviewing the likely pattern over the first 10 years of the economics of an independent Scotland. Now here we are, Scotland votes yes in September the 18th, 2014. Things go well because there's a deal done quite quickly with the UK government by the end of the year 2015. And the markets are fully satisfied with bringing in luminaries like Mervyn King, the former Governor of the Bank of England, to help Scotland with its monetary policy approach. So starts off pretty favourably. And then, of course, there are some bumps in the road. The biggest of which is Scotland's no sooner independent in 2016, formally independent, and the rest of the UK votes for Brexit. So what would have happened, do you think, in that early period of the establishment of an independent Scotland, as far as the economy is concerned?
I think that, as you quite rightly say, bringing in the luminaries and stabilising the markets with people like Mervyn King, who would have been a big deal in terms of just assuring people that the sterling currency deal was perfectly well handled by somebody that knew exactly what he was doing with sterling. But the problem would have been Brexit and just what was happening there. Now, of course, had it been me, Alex, I would have been voting for Brexit for Scotland, but given that most people in Scotland didn't vote for Brexit, we would have been left in. And the biggest problem for Scotland at that point would have been keeping the currency down, because I'm afraid there would have been a lot of people trying to jam their way into Scotland as a place to do business, rather than what was left of the UK outside the European Union. And given that we had the same currency at that point, it would have meant that there was a huge amount of activity going on in the Scottish economy as people moved from England.
So you're talking like a flow of businesses?
Absolutely.
So just as England's been scratching its head what to do with the people coming over the channel in boats, but why would it be a problem to have an influx of businesses?
It's not so much a problem in the long term, Alex. It's about the short term and whether or not your infrastructure, your soft infrastructure, which means your human capital, can handle that amount of activity, and that it would have been a huge amount of activity. We, at the moment, don't have the roll-on, roll-off ferry links that we should have with the rest of Europe. We don't have the ease in getting our goods out of the country, except via England, which would, of course, then have been outside the EU.
But then we've had a rapid development of these things in the Republic of Ireland over the last few years, presumably to face similar circumstances.
The same thing would have happened in Scotland, and that would have been very good news in terms of economic activity. So I think we would have been winners out of it all, but it would have been quite a tough point in our development just right at the start of it.
So you're saying it would be a good policy to invest in the Scythe and the River Forth?
Absolutely right, yeah. And indeed in the River Clyde, because I think people forget that we're quite close to some of the French ports via the western routes, not just the east. So it would have been
probably old enough to remember the ocean span. You remember the great idea of the west of Scotland as an entry port, transfer across the east of Scotland, and maybe that would have been revived.
Well, who knows? My PhD was on Scottish international trade and in particular trade through Scottish ports, so I could maybe have revived that. So I might have got a job in your economic advisor list.
Oh, well, I'm waiting to get your first Nobel laureate, and then of course that would have happened. That's quite interesting. It shows that in any economic situation, there are always things you've got to handle. There's issues come up, you've got to handle them. But in many ways, the issues of fast growth, of potential growth, are much easier to handle than the ones where your economy is flat as a pancake and nothing's happening. Now, on one hand, if the US-UK had voted for Brexit, as you say, clearly people would have sensed an opportunity being in Scotland. Another advantage would have been Scotland would be negotiating that trade deal with 500 million other Europeans behind it in our camp. But on the other hand, it would be the border area of Europe, and as you say, that would bring issues with it. So it would require careful handling, but not something that would be out of the box for a government to face.
It shouldn't be out of the box, but as I say, the big problem is differential growth in two parts of the same island, who up until that point have the same currency and who have relatively similar rates of economic growth. But if we start to grow much faster than England was, and the pressures start coming on to the currency as a result of Brexit, downward pressure, when in fact what we would have needed was upward pressure, then it's the difficulties can arise.
Are you saying that then, because obviously a key aspect of the choice that I made running into the referendum of sticking with sterling was that both Scotland and the rest of the UK were expected to continue in the European Union. If it happened the rest of the UK went out, then would it be a time to look at, well, the two options remaining to you would be to have your own currency or alternatively to join up with the euro. So would that be the choice that the Scottish Government would have faced at that stage?
It would have been a choice in terms of the way that they set the stall out. Of course, the Europeans aren't really kind of completely on board with people just adopting the euro. You've got to meet certain conditions.
Of course.
And I'm not quite sure that at that point that we would have been meeting them, not least about the fact that there would have been upward pressure on any Scottish version of sterling.
Mind you, wouldn't be the only one in the euro area in that position.
No, that's true. So at that point it would probably have been much more likely that we would have taken the decision to adopt and launch a new currency. And again, it would have posed its own problems because this would have been a strengthening currency against sterling. But it would have given people a big opportunity at that point to make a shift in their assets. One of the key issues, as you remember, with the independence debate and the run-up to the vote was just the whole problem of pensions and about mortgages which were in sterling, and it was one of the reasons that you pushed the whole sterling, automatic sterling move for Scotland after independence vote, because it meant that people were able to keep their assets in the same currency that they were set in, pensions and mortgages. But at this point, where sterling is in a different boat altogether because of the exit from the EU, maybe people would have wanted a different boat to jump into for their assets with a stronger currency, which would have been the new Scottish currency.
So you're saying, I mean, obviously there's no particular reason why people can't be allowed to keep their assets in sterling if they so wish. So it's a fully transferable currency. But you're saying, obviously, if they had a strengthening Scottish currency, the temptation would be to shift your assets, which again would reinforce the strength of the currency.
Correct.
So these are problems of economic management. Again, the problem, but there's many countries in the world who have managed to cope with fast economic growth.
Sure.
Aren't the fundamentals you're far better to cope with the problems of wealth than sustain the problems of poverty?
No, absolutely, and that's right. But we need to recognise that there are problems with fast growth, and there are problems that you have to negotiate. And I'm quite certain we would have been able to negotiate them. Lower taxes would certainly have helped us to reduce the amount of money flowing into government coffers, which would have been probably part of the reason that that sterling would have been strengthening. Of course, that would have exacerbated the fast growth, but there we go. That's again yet another problem of prosperity.
You've put your finger on that. You'd have to, in that scenario, with the rest of the UK voting for Brexit, you need a fast development of export facilities round the coastline of Scotland. You would also have needed, would you not, better infrastructure, certainly in the southwest of Scotland, where of course the route to Ireland and to Northern Ireland, which again in this scenario would also be in the single market. I mean, that kind of deplorable infrastructure, road infrastructure, would have to have been substantially enhanced, would it not?
Well, I think it would have been sensible. We would have had a lot of calls for dualling of the A77 and various other parts of the infrastructure down in Ayrshire, which I think many people in Ayrshire would be very happy about, and if that happened. And certainly into, as you quite rightly say, the right down south into the links with Northern Ireland, and of course then the links into the Republic of Ireland, which is part of the EU. So we would all be in the EU together with better road links, and gosh, maybe even Alistair Jack's bridge.
Was it not a tunnel eventually?
Well, maybe it was a tunnel.
I've looked at I mean, you may remember that I was fond of in the 90s of the concept of the arc of prosperity, which got slightly tarnished when Iceland encountered some difficulties in the financial crisis. But then again, if we look what's happening now, I mean, Ireland, Iceland, Norway, that arc has re-established itself very powerfully. Would you think economics in that situation, you want to orientate yourself towards these countries as well as the wider European Union?
Well, I think there are natural links there anyway, and that would have been the need for those links would have been increased given the exit away from the UK market. Not so much the UK market, we'd still be obviously exporting huge amounts of goods and services to the UK, but just the ease of moving the business to different parts of the European Union and the EFTA area. That would have been a big advantage.
Let's look wider afield. I mean, one of the relatively few things I agree with David Cameron about was fostering a strong economic relationship with China. Since Cameron's time, that relationship has gone into, if not the deep freeze, then certainly into the chiller.
Yeah.
An independent Scotland would have been able to pursue a more economically cooperative policy. Would there have been big advantage there in terms of investment patterns and trade flow?
I think it almost goes without saying, although it seems to be, it needs to be said more and more often these days, that you're much better dealing with the fastest growing economies in the world than you are in dealing with the slowest growing economies in the world, because that's where the market is expanding. I mean, if you look back at the period after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the country that saved the whole global economy was China, because it was growing so much faster in terms of its import demand than places like America, Europe and elsewhere. And that hasn't stopped. I mean, it's gone through a wee bit of a struggling point at the moment, But for most of the last 10 years, China has been the biggest engine of economic growth in the global economy. Now it's kind of handing it over to India. So maybe some of our ties with India, with the subcontinent, and with China would have been a fantastic deal for Scottish business.
Maybe after Glasgow 2014, we should have just, and the difficulty they've had with getting sites for the Commonwealth Games since, we should just offer to do it every 4 years to help strengthen some of these. Having built the infrastructure, we may as well run the thing every 4 years.
Not?
But I mean, you know, you yourself as an international Scot, a substantial figure in Asian economics over a long period of time. Do you know, I mean, when you come back to Scotland, as you do frequently, that contrast between a booming Asian economy and a kind of backwater European economy, that must get you, well, must actually make you quite angry at times, doesn't it?
Well, it's frustrating, Alex, because you know there's nothing to stop parts of Europe, and that really means Scotland, being involved in the growth that the rest of the world, and that means Asia, is producing. And just the kinds of ties that we could have through our universities, through our expertise in various industries, through renewable energy, through food. It's mind-blowing as to the opportunities we've passed up in the last 10 years.
Well, let's take just one of the things you've mentioned, universities. Some Scottish universities, vastly expanded. Old University of St Andrews, you know, has maybe a third of its student population have been Chinese in recent years, and certainly in certain subjects. But is there any reason why that expansion couldn't have continued and even enlarged? I mean, you know, why you know, St Andrews had 3,000 students when I was there in the late 70s. Now it's 15,000. Why not 30,000? You know, why not double the size of the Scottish university sector if the market is there from overseas students to attend it?
And not only would the market be there, the market would be growing, Alex, because the Americans seem intent in trying to push Chinese people out of their country. You know, I tell you, these are the hardest working, academically gifted, thoughtful people that you can imagine. Getting them into our country and, yes, populating the universities, but trying to get them to stay here and be part of the community, that would just be the big advantage that Scotland could get.
And of course reinforce what Scotland has at the present moment, but doesn't always use, the soft power influence of, I mean, I remember going to Tehran a few years back, and my security detail, which was quite extensive, came to see me and said a group of people had gathered outside the hotel and they were kind of worried about it. And I said, well, who are they? They said, well, they are Iranians who were educated in Scotland who want to come and see. And I said, well, bring them in. Well, just as an example. But, you know, Scotland has lots and lots of people with Scottish connections around the world, and reinforcing that could have been and could still be a tremendous advantage.
Lots of connections and lots of attractions to people around the world. The history, the architecture, the reputation of academia, the reputation of Scottish industry. These still play very large in people's minds in the subcontinent, in the Chinese arena, elsewhere in Southeast Asia, and I'm sure elsewhere as well, as you say, the Middle East. But you know, it's just coining in on these advantages. The sad thing about not having independence is that that's just not happened.
Well, let's just say you snuck your way into the Council of Economic Advisors. Let's say you were chairing it now, and you've got this First Minister in the final years of his long period in office, and I say to you, Dr. Walker, how do we make sure that our economy benefits long term from perhaps producing 10 times as much electrical energy as we need from floating wind farms at a very competitive rate? How do we make sure you benefit long term from that?
Well, you make sure that you sell the assets at a very good price to anybody that's willing to buy them, and anybody willing to generate that electricity and that expertise, including the technology, into something that can be utilised by generations of Scots to come. It's just like taxing oil. You've got to tax the resources that you've got, and the resources that we've got are renewable, they're academic. We sell them to the rest of the world and people are willing to invest in them. And you've got to really build a fund that is going to benefit the people of Scotland going forward. And that's sadly something that the UK has failed to do. I'm sure that First Minister Alex Salmond would have done that without even thinking about it.
And now, last question. 10 years after independence, as we look at this landscape, having solved some of the problems of pressure on infrastructure, etc., coped with that, gone through COVID, now looking at a pretty benign energy outlook in terms of Scotland, but with challenges elsewhere. Where would you see the new Scotland moving into the 2030s and beyond in terms of how it can make its mark?
Well, the big thing now for Scotland as we move into the next 10 years is making sure that our young people have been properly educated, well educated, thoughtful about the rest of the world, engaged with the rest of the world, and basically giving them the kind of chances to be participating with the rest of the world that the rest of the world wants to do in coming to Scotland to study. So we've got to re-establish those links, get Scotland out into the world and get our young people educated about what the world's got to offer them.
And would that be an economic potential that any international economist worth his salt would want to engage in?
I think broadening knowledge and broadening links with the global economy is something that any economist would tell you is worth its weight in gold.
Dr. Jim Walker, many thanks for taking this look at the prospects of the economy of an independent Scotland.
Thanks a lot, Alex.
Water is life, but not all water is equal. Our water ionizer restructures and alkalizes water for optimum hydration and detoxification, recreating the planet's ultimate water sources, found in lightning-struck lakes and newly melted icebergs. H2 Pure Source. Change your water. Change your life.
Now, in last week's show, we took a look at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and talked to two veterans, Owen Dudley-Edwards and Grouse Peter, also known as Gareth Wardell. Here's what they had to say about the Edinburgh Fringe Festival.
Now, Owen, let's turn to you first. Give us the historical context. I mean, this is a remarkable post-war phenomenon. But how did the Edinburgh Festival originate?
1947, Europe and indeed the world devastated. Edinburgh itself, backwater of the Battle of Britain while it was on, desperately trying to retain a genteel delicacy sounding as much like the most respectable part of London as possible. Comes Glyndebourne Opera, which wants to start up again, but is fighting with the English Arts Council, and a brilliant young Scottish cultural advisor and historian, Henry Harvey Wood, said, but there are English-speaking places which are not under the English Arts Council. How about Edinburgh? Gets together with some of the locals, suggests that they can do it, uses the director of Glyndebourne, Rudolph Byng, whose first idea was they should start off at the High Mass in St. Giles Cathedral. He then, since he was Austrian to start with, had to be told not only about Scotland being different from England, but about Protestantism being different from Catholicism. Despite that, they brought Glyndebourne Opera in 1947. They brought in several companies of various kinds. They attracted attention from the United States, and they attracted the attention of Queen Elizabeth, the wife of George VI, who was told, we want to revive real European culture. We want people to love each other instead of hating each other. This will be war work continued. So she came herself, she brought her husband, she brought her children, and at that point, of course, everybody wanted to go to the Edinburgh Festival. Meanwhile, the Edinburgh featured bringing again together Bruno Walter, who had been the Jewish conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, driven out of the orchestra and out of Europe by the Nazis, now returned, brought together again with his old orchestra in 47, a perfect symbol of the new cultural word of reunion and love, which was being started up again.
Great, Owen. So this was a piece of serendipity, graced by royalty, which started off the Edinburgh Festival, which is, 70, 80 years later has become this.
Huge.
So, I mean, Gareth, you've been many productions at the festival. You've seen it grow over the years. Can you put your finger on what's happened?
Well, the Fringe has got out of hand, and the official festival, as they called it, the Edinburgh International Arts Festival, has atrophied, which is a shame. My hobby horse is that professional stand-up comedians are using the August festival as their August gig. And the whole point about the Fringe is it was set up for new, raw, fresh talent to get a platform. But instead, what we have now is people looking for somewhere to go and see and enjoy. They can't make up their mind because the Fringe booklet is that thick. And so they say, oh, there's a comedian I've seen on television, I'll go and see him instead. And they get 20 minutes for their £30 ticket.
And here's what you had to say in your tweets, messages and emails of last week. Craig Sheridan says, interesting show as ever, Alex and Tasmina. Grouse Beater, Gareth Wardell, has always been a man worth listening to. Owen Dudley-Edwards is a real character. He certainly is, Craig. Peem says, thanks for another super show. Great to see Alex ruminating with Messrs Dudley-Edwards and Wardell on a breezy, sunny day in Edinburgh. Andy White says, he's right to say the Fringe has got out of hand. I live and work in Edinburgh and it's a bleep nightmare. Not helped by the Edinburgh taxpayer has to clean up the mess when it's finished. And finally, Kizzy Wiz says, I wish that I could come on the 14th of September. Of course, Kizzy is talking about this show. But I'm getting a new knee in 2 weeks. I'll be with you in spirit. Meanwhile, an interesting show. Thank you. Love, Grouse Beater. Thank you very much indeed for your tweets, messages and emails. Please do keep them coming in, and please don't forget to send us ideas for future shows. Of course, for the next 3 or 4 weeks we're focusing on an independent Scotland and what that might have looked like 10 years on from 2014. But before we turn to Alex and his summation of this week's show. Let me just remind you of what's happening on the 14th of September, just 3 weeks away, at the IMAX Cinema in the Science Centre in Glasgow. That's when we're looking at 10 years since the independence referendum of September 2014. I'll look back at what was then and the campaign that we so much enjoyed and where we go now. And myself and Alex will be joined by a variety of guests, including commentator and broadcaster Bernard Ponsonby, and some members of the campaign groups Lawyers for Yes, NHS for Yes and Business for Yes, where of course Joanna Cherry, KC, Dr Philippa Whitford and Michelle Thompson. And we'll also be joined by the author of the Great Wee Blue Book, a book which played a huge part in the referendum campaign. Yes, you can look forward to seeing the Reverend Stuart Campbell and of course Alex Neil Fergus-Ewing and many, many more. Here's how you can get your tickets. And now, over to Alex.
So what a fascinating interview with Dr Jim Walker, Asia Money Economist of the Year umpteen times, voted top economist in Asia more times than most of us have had hot dinners. And who better to look at the economic prospects of Scotland over the last 10 years if we'd voted yes in 2014. And what was interesting about the interview with Jim is we're talking about real economics, the economics of growth, of people, of infrastructure, of facilities, of how you handle the issues which have presented itself to Scotland with a growing economy. Because our problems over the last 10 years have been stuck in the UK, growth flat as a pancake, dealing with the problems of austerity. The problems of what happens if Scotland starts growing fast are there, but equally it's much better to handle the problems of prosperity and growth than it is to handle the problems of poverty and an economy which is not going anywhere. So Jim Walker put his finger on some of the key issues. You'd have needed in Scotland a substantial increase in infrastructure in the southwest of Scotland, in the port facilities of Scotland. You need a plan to enhance the facilities to cope with the number of businesses and people who would want to come to Scotland. And you'd also be planning to make sure that this time round, now that we have nobody to blame but ourselves, that we harness the vast energy from renewables and make sure that's a long-term benefit to the independent Scotland in the way that independent Norway has shown the way over oil and gas over the last 30 years. So these are the issues that the economy of Scotland we've had to face over the last 10 years, and some of the issues I've been looking forward to as we move into the next decade and beyond. I don't think there's much doubt in my mind it would have been a far better 10 years than the 10 years we've had. But let's also look at the politics and the social attitudes of Scotland, how Scotland would fit in internationally. Because man and woman doesn't live by bread alone, so the next few episodes of this programme will look at some of these other areas. But I've got no doubt over this month we're going to have a fascinating insight into what an independent Scotland would have looked like 10 years after we voted for independence in 2014.
And with that, we come sadly to the end of this show, but do join us next week, same time, perhaps not the same place, but a different place, as we're discussing the future of Scotland, or what Scotland might have looked like had we voted yes in 2014. So we'll see you next week. Please do join us then. Bye for now.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.